Duke Sebastian Langley demanded only two things from his penniless bride: an heir and silence. He never expected the quiet woman he'd acquired would hold a secret that could unravel his entire lineage, a secret whispered in letters sent in the dead of night. He thought he was in control, the master of his gilded cage, but he had no idea the woman sleeping down the hall was plotting a course that could destroy everything he held dear. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The light that filtered through the stained glass windows of the Langley Estate Chapel did little to warm the cavernous space. It was a weak, watery sunlight, illuminating millions of dust motes that danced in the still, cold air like tiny, silent ghosts. The scent of the chapel was the scent of ages, a heavy perfume of old stone, beeswax from 1,000 candles, and the cloying sweetness of wilting lilies that lined the altar in funereal arrangements. Duke Sebastian Langley stood at that altar, tall and unyielding, his formal attire a suit of black armor against the world. His jaw was set like granite, a muscle twitching in his cheek, the only sign of the immense pressure he felt. Above him, the painted eyes of his ancestors stared down from their portraits, a gallery of judges weighing his every action. He could feel their collective gaze, a physical weight upon his shoulders. He looked at the woman beside him, Miss Margaret Ellis, soon to be his Duchess. She was dressed in a simple gown of borrowed silk, a pale cream that made her look even more fragile and insignificant against the grandeur of the chapel. She appeared demure, her head slightly bowed, but the hands she clasped in front of her, though tight, were perfectly steady. Her gaze, when it flickered up, was not one of a frightened girl, but of a keen observer, taking in every detail of her surroundings, of him. The ceremony was mercifully brief, the priest's words echoing in the oppressive silence, devoid of any genuine warmth or celebration. Their vows were exchanged in clipped formal tones, a contractual agreement spoken into existence. Let this be over, Sebastian thought, his mind a storm of grim calculations. Let her be plain, quiet, and produce an heir. That is all I require to keep the vultures at bay. The estate's finances were a precarious house of cards, a truth known only to him and his solicitor. This marriage, to a woman with no name and no dowry, was a desperate, last-ditch measure to project an image of stability he did not possess. A duchess in the house would quell the more insidious rumors, at least for a time. Margaret felt his stormy grey eyes on her and did not waver. He looks at me as if I am another piece of furniture acquired for the estate, she thought, a cold resolve hardening within her, a necessary, if unlovely, addition. He has no idea who I am, or why I am truly here. Her purpose was a secret she held close, a burning ember in the cold landscape of her new life. When Sebastian took her hand to place the ring on her finger, his touch was cold and impersonal, the brief contact of skin on skin doing nothing to bridge the chasm between them. The heavy gold band, bearing the Langley seal, felt like a manacle sliding into place. She did not flinch. She simply accepted it, her expression unreadable. The priest declared them man and wife, and the deed was done. The power imbalance was stark, a palpable force in the air. He was the duke, the master, and she was his possession, or so he believed. Later, in the duke's study at Langley Manor, the chill of the chapel followed them. It was a deeply masculine room, a fortress of dark, polished wood, shelves groaning with leather-bound books, and the glassy-eyed stares of hunting trophies mounted on the walls. A large fireplace, its hearth cold and black, dominated one wall, a dark mouth that offered no warmth. Sebastian stood before it, his back to the empty grate, and outlined Margaret's duties with the detached air of a general issuing orders to a subordinate. He spoke of appearances, of the social obligations she would now be expected to fulfill, and above all, the absolute importance of discretion. "Your role is simple, madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that matched the somber room. "You will manage the household staff, a task I trust you are capable of. You will attend the requisite social functions by my side, smiling when required. And above all, you will not bring any undue attention, any hint of scandal or gossip, to this family. Is that understood?" Margaret sat in a high-backed chair opposite him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had listened patiently, her gaze fixed on his face, absorbing every word. She was not intimidated by his tone or the imposing nature of the room. She had faced far worse than a proud, burdened man. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace," she replied, her voice quiet but clear, carrying a note of intelligence that was impossible to ignore. "Discretion is a quality I have always valued. You will find I am very good at keeping things quiet." Her calm unnerved him. He had expected tears, or perhaps a nervous deference. Instead, she met his cold authority with a quiet fortitude that felt like a subtle form of resistance. She was not a frightened mouse. He had the unsettling feeling that he had just laid out the rules of a game to an opponent who already knew how to play. The emotional distance between them was a chasm, wide and deep, and for the first time, he wondered what lay on the other side. That night, Margaret was shown to her chambers. They were opulent, far grander than anything she had ever known, with a large canopied bed, silk wallpaper, and a small balcony overlooking the sprawling, meticulously manicured gardens. Yet, the room felt impersonal, a luxurious cage decorated to another's taste. She was alone, the silence of the great house pressing in on her. From a simple traveling trunk, she unpacked her few personal effects. There was not much: a change of clothes, a few books, and a small worn wooden box. She placed the box on a small writing desk near the window, the moonlight casting a silver glow across its surface. With gentle fingers, she opened the lid. Inside lay a faded miniature portrait of a kind-faced man and a stack of old letters, tied together with a simple, faded blue ribbon. She touched the letters for a moment, drawing strength from them, before setting them aside. She took out a fresh sheet of heavy paper, a quill and a pot of ink. As she sat at the desk, her entire posture changed. The demure, quiet bride from the chapel and the study vanished, replaced by a woman of intense, burning focus. The moonlight caught the sharp line of her jaw, the determined set of her mouth. She dipped the quill into the ink, the only sound in the room the soft scratch of the nib against the paper as she began to write, her pen moving with an urgent, desperate energy. "My dearest Elle," the letter began. "The first part of the plan is complete. I am now the Duchess of Langley. The house is as cold as its master, but my resolve is not. He is proud and blind, consumed by the weight of a title he does not know is built on sand. He suspects nothing. He sees only what he wants to see, a penniless girl he can control." Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside her door. Her head snapped up, her heart instantly pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. With a single swift movement, she blew out the candle, plunging the room into near total darkness. Her other hand instinctively covered the wet ink on the page. She held her breath, listening, every nerve on fire. Heavy, measured footsteps approached, paused for a fraction of a second outside her door, and then continued down the long, silent corridor. Only when the sound had faded completely did she allow herself to breathe again. With trembling hands, she quickly folded the letter, slid it beneath the others in the wooden box, and closed the lid, her secret life once again hidden from view. Days bled into weeks. Sebastian remained a distant, formidable presence, consumed by the endless task of managing the estate's precarious finances, a battle he waged in secret. He saw his new duchess at dinner, a silent figure at the other end of the long, polished table. He noted, with a grudging approval, her quiet efficiency. The household staff, who had been prone to laziness and gossip, now moved with a newfound purpose. The manor ran with a smoothness it had not seen in years. She was capable, he would give her that. But he remained wary, the sense of a hidden depth to her character refusing to dissipate. One evening, long after the house had settled into its nightly slumber, he was returning to his own chambers from the study, his mind still wrestling with ledgers that refused to balance. As he passed down the corridor where the Duchess's rooms were located, he noticed a sliver of golden light from beneath her door. It was well past midnight. A flicker of curiosity, an emotion he had not felt in a long time, stirred within him. What was she doing awake at this hour? He paused, his hand hovering near the doorknob, before he dismissed the impulse. It was not his concern, and yet, as he walked away, a seed of suspicion, long dormant and buried under the weight of his own troubles, began to stir. He had married her for her silence, for her ability to be invisible. He was beginning to suspect she was anything but. The suspicion was a splinter under his skin, a constant, irritating presence. For nights, the memory of that sliver of light from under Margaret's door had troubled Sebastian's already restless sleep. He would lie awake in the vast, cold emptiness of his ducal bed, staring into the darkness, his mind replaying the image. It was a trivial thing, a wife reading late into the night, yet it felt like a betrayal of their unspoken contract. She was meant to be a placid surface, a calm and still pool. That light suggested hidden depths, currents he could not see. Tonight, the splinter festered. Sleep was an impossibility. Throwing back the heavy brocade covers, he rose and pulled on a dressing gown. The house was tomb-silent, the air heavy and cold. He walked the dimly lit corridors of Langley Manor, his bare feet silent on the polished wood floors. Long, distorted shadows stretched from suits of armor that stood like silent sentinels, their metal gleaming faintly in the moonlight that slanted through the tall windows. The eyes of his ancestors followed him from their portraits, their painted faces stern and disapproving. He was the guardian of their legacy, and he was failing. As he neared the wing containing her chambers, he stopped. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of her doorway. It was Margaret. She moved with a quiet, fluid grace that surprised him, not the hesitant shuffle of a woman navigating an unfamiliar house, but the sure, purposeful stride of someone with a destination. She was cloaked in a simple dark wrap, her face pale in the gloom. His heart gave a hard, sudden thud. This was not a midnight stroll. This was a mission. His curiosity, now sharpened into a blade of pure suspicion, took over. Melting back into the alcove of a large tapestry, he watched her go, then followed, a shadow tracking a shadow. She did not look back. She moved through the sleeping house as if she owned it, her path certain. She led him down the grand staircase, across the checkered marble of the main hall, and towards the east wing, towards the library. The library doors were immense, carved from oak that was nearly black with age. She slipped through them without a sound. Sebastian followed, his breath held tight in his chest. The library was his sanctuary, a cathedral of knowledge and silence. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. Moonlight streamed through the arched windows, painting silver rectangles on the floor and illuminating the spines of thousands of books. He watched from the deep shadow of the doorway as Margaret moved directly to a specific, remote aisle, one filled with dusty tomes on agricultural law and land management. She did not hesitate. She ran her fingers along a single shelf, counting, and retrieved a thick, leather-bound volume. He expected her to open it, to read. Instead, she produced a small, sealed letter from within her wrap. With deft, practiced fingers, she slipped the letter between the pages of the book, closed it, and slid it back into its precise place on the shelf. Her task complete, she turned and glided from the room, as silent as she had entered. Sebastian remained frozen in the shadows, his mind racing. A secret correspondence. In my own home. The book was a dead drop. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. His first thought was of a lover, a clandestine affair conducted under his own roof. The humiliation of it, the sheer audacity, made his blood run hot. But who? And why? Then darker thoughts crowded in. Was she a spy, sent by one of his many creditors? A blackmailer, gathering information to use against him? Each possibility was more venomous than the last. He felt a prick of betrayal, an emotion so unexpected it startled him with its intensity. Why should he feel betrayed? Their marriage was a sham, a business arrangement. Yet, the sight of her, so secretive and self-possessed, felt like a personal affront, a violation of his domain and his trust. He had bought and paid for a duchess, and he had gotten a conspirator instead. The following day, Sebastian was a man possessed. The image of Margaret hiding the letter was burned into his mind. He watched her across the breakfast table, her expression placid, her conversation limited to polite inquiries about the day's menus. The contrast between her serene facade and her nocturnal activities was maddening. He had to know more. He waited, his patience stretched to a thread, until he saw her walk out into the gardens with the head groundskeeper, pointing and gesturing, the very picture of a diligent lady of the manor. This was his chance. He felt like a trespasser in his own house as he walked towards her chambers. He told himself it was his right. He was her husband, the master of this house. There were to be no secrets from him. Still, his hand hesitated on the cool brass of the doorknob, a pang of guilt warring with his burning need for answers. He pushed the guilt aside and entered. Her room was just as he remembered it, opulent yet impersonal. It was tidy, almost Spartan in its neatness. There was no feminine clutter, no sign that a life was truly being lived here. It was the room of a guest, not a duchess. His eyes scanned the space and landed on the one object that seemed personal, the small, worn wooden box on her vanity. He moved towards it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He lifted the lid. The faded miniature portrait of the unknown man stared up at him, his expression gentle. Beneath it lay the stack of letters, tied with their faded blue ribbon. These were not the letters she was writing, he realized. These were letters she had received. The handwriting on the top envelope was different, a strong, masculine script. His guilt was consumed by a wave of dreadful curiosity. He untied the ribbon. He told himself he would only look at one. He pulled a letter from the middle of the stack and unfolded it. The ink was faded, the paper soft with age. He began to read. It was not a love letter. The words that leaped out at him were cold, hard, and sharp. The time for patience is ending, my dearest sister. For 20 years we have waited. For 20 years the great injustice committed against our family has gone unanswered. His blood ran cold. Sister, he read on, his eyes devouring the words. The debt that must be paid by the House of Langley is not one of money, but of honor. He stole our name, our land, our future. The current duke, this Sebastian, wallows in his stolen inheritance, ignorant of the rot in his foundations. You must not falter. You are our only hope of finding the proof. Suddenly, he heard the crunch of gravel on the path outside the window. He looked down and saw her consultation with the groundskeeper finished, walking back towards the house. Panic, an emotion he rarely felt, seized him. He shoved the letter back into the stack, his fingers clumsy, fumbling with the ribbon. He dropped the lid of the box closed and strode from the room, pulling the door silently shut behind him, just as he heard her footsteps ascending the main staircase. He leaned against the wall in the corridor, his heart hammering, the damning words echoing in his mind. Great injustice, debt to be paid by the House of Langley. This was not about a secret lover. This was about him, about his family, about a past he knew nothing about. His suspicion had been a flickering candle flame. Now it was a raging inferno, and at its heart was a cold, terrifying dread. That evening, the formal dining room felt like a battlefield. The elaborate dinner for two, served by silent, nervous footmen, sat mostly untouched on the fine china. A dozen candles burned in a silver candelabra between them, their flames dancing, casting flickering shadows that made the vast room seem even larger, the distance between Sebastian and Margaret even greater. The silence was a living thing, thick with unspoken words, heavy with accusation. Sebastian could no longer contain himself. He had spent the afternoon in a torment of speculation, the words from the letter branded onto his thoughts. With a sharp, impatient wave of his hand, he dismissed the servants. The moment the door clicked shut, the fragile pretense of civility shattered. "I know you are writing letters, Margaret," he began, his voice low and dangerous, a controlled tremor of fury running through it. He watched her for any sign of fear, of guilt. "I know you are hiding them in my library. Who is he? What is your purpose in this house?" Margaret placed her fork down with deliberate slowness. She raised her eyes to meet his, and he was stunned to see not fear, but a cold, challenging composure. Her chin was lifted, her gaze unwavering. "I am writing to my brother," she said, her voice perfectly even. It was a partial truth, delivered with such utter conviction that a lesser man might have believed it. "He worries for my welfare, alone in a new home." Sebastian let out a short, harsh laugh, devoid of humor. "Your brother," he repeated, leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of the polished table. "The one who speaks of injustice and debts to be paid, the one who believes the House of Langley owes him something." That was the blow that landed. Her mask finally, irrevocably, slipped. A flicker of pure, undiluted fear crossed her face, so swift he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so intently. It was there and then gone, replaced by a flash of defiant anger. "You had no right," she hissed, her voice losing its careful modulation, now sharp with outrage. "You had no right to go through my personal belongings." "I have every right," he thundered, his control snapping. He pushed his chair back and stood, his large frame looming over her, casting her in his shadow. "This is my house. You are my wife. Your secrets are my secrets." To his astonishment, she did not shrink away. She rose to her feet as well, her back straight, her head held high, refusing to be intimidated. They stood on opposite sides of the table, adversaries in a war he was only just beginning to understand. "You know nothing of my life, of what I have endured," she said, her voice trembling with a passion he had never imagined she possessed. "You see a penniless bride, a convenience. You do not see the woman." "Then show me the woman," he shot back, his anger escalating, fueled by her defiance. "Show me the conspirator who uses my home as a postbox. Tell me what this injustice is." In the heat of the moment, he moved, rounding the table in 2 long strides until he stood directly before her. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers closing around the soft flesh of her forearm. "Tell me," he demanded, his face inches from hers. The physical contact was like a lightning strike. A jolt, powerful and unexpected, shot through both of them. The air crackled. The rage, the suspicion, the years of cold, lonely pride, all of it was momentarily incinerated in a sudden, shocking flare of awareness. He was intensely aware of her, of the frantic pulse beating in her wrist beneath his fingers, of the scent of lavender from her hair, of the way her chest rose and fell with her ragged breaths. Her eyes, wide and startled, were locked on his. The anger in them was gone, replaced by something else, something wild and confusing that mirrored the turmoil in his own chest. They stood frozen, locked in that volatile embrace, the silence of the room roaring in their ears. The anger was forgotten, the questions unanswered, replaced by a startling, terrifying, and undeniable connection that had nothing to do with duty or secrets, and everything to do with the man and woman they were beneath it all. The confrontation left them both shaken, the fragile truce of their marriage shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sebastian was now obsessed, his mind a whirlwind of questions and fears. He knew he could not force the truth from her. Her will was as strong as his own, but he could lie in wait. He knew she would try to communicate with her mysterious brother again, and he knew the library was the key. The house became a battlefield of wills, a silent, tense war waged in shared meals and averted glances. Margaret, for her part, knew she was running out of time. His discovery of the old letters had been a devastating blow, but his open confrontation was worse. He was no longer a distant, oblivious husband. He was a hunter, and she was his prey. For 3 nights, Sebastian waited. He feigned sleep, retiring to his chambers early, only to slip out into the cold, silent corridors of the manor. He became a ghost in his own home, a shadow lurking near the grand library doors. On the 3rd night, his vigilance was rewarded. The rain that had been threatening all day finally broke, lashing against the tall, arched windows in a furious, relentless downpour. The sound of the storm masked the creak of the floorboards as he saw a figure emerge from the servants' quarters. A young stable boy, no more than 16, his face pale with nerves. The boy scurried towards the library, clutching his cap in his hands. Sebastian's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This was the courier. He let the boy enter the library, giving him a full minute before he followed, his steps silent on the thick Persian rug. He found the boy in the remote aisle, his hand just reaching for the heavy volume on agricultural law. "Leave it." Sebastian's voice was a low growl, cutting through the sound of the rain. The boy froze, his eyes wide with terror as he turned and saw the Duke, a towering, formidable figure in the gloom. "Your Grace," he stammered, snatching his hand back as if the book were red hot. "I was just tidying." "Do not lie to me, Thomas," Sebastian said, his voice dangerously soft. "I will not have my staff involved in the Duchess's private affairs. Go back to your bed. Forget you were ever here. Your loyalty is to this house, and to me. Do you understand?" The boy nodded frantically, his face ashen, and practically fled the room. Sebastian turned his attention to the book. He pulled it from the shelf, its leather cover cool beneath his fingers. He opened it, and there, nestled between pages detailing crop rotation, was a freshly sealed letter. He did not hesitate. He broke the wax seal, the small act of violation sending a tremor of anticipation through him. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the elegant, urgent script. "L," it began. "He knows. He found the letters. I fear he is closer to the truth of our grandfather and the Blackwood estate. His pride is a fortress, but I have seen a crack in the walls. He is more troubled by his family's finances than he lets on. We must accelerate the search for the ledger. It is our only proof, our only path to justice. I will begin searching the old archives tomorrow." He watches my every move. Be careful. Blackwood Estate. The name struck Sebastian like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled back against a bookshelf, the letter crinkling in his clenched fist. The Blackwood Estate. It was not a name he had heard spoken aloud in years, but he knew it. It was a sprawling, valuable piece of land that bordered the Langley holdings to the north, absorbed into their estate 2 generations ago under his grandfather's tenure. The official story, the one passed down in the family, was that Lord Blackwood had been a degenerate gambler who had run his estate into the ground, and his grandfather, the ever-astute Duke, had simply made a shrewd business deal to acquire the property when it fell into ruin. But now, Margaret's letter painted a far darker picture. A picture of theft, a picture of a crime that had been buried for 50 years. The ledger, the proof, a cold dread, far more chilling than the damp air of the library, seeped into his bones. The honor he had fought so desperately to protect, the legacy he had sacrificed his own happiness for, was not just tarnished, it was a phantom, a lie. His anger at Margaret, so hot and fierce just moments before, was now mixed with a terrifying fear of what he was about to uncover, a fear that the entire foundation of his life was built on nothing but rot and ruin. The next morning, Sebastian summoned Margaret to his study. He did not wait for pleasantries. He stood behind his great oak desk, the intercepted letter placed squarely in the center of the polished surface, a declaration of war. The air in the room was thick with tension, heavy and suffocating. Margaret entered, her face pale but her expression composed. She saw the letter, and her composure faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny intake of breath that was the only sign of her shock. She had been caught. "The Blackwood Estate," Sebastian said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "My grandfather. Explain this. Now." He watched her, ready for more lies, more evasions, but he saw something shift in her eyes. The cornered fear was replaced by a weary resignation, and then a spark of the same defiant fire he had seen in the dining room. She knew the game was up. She walked slowly to the desk, her gaze never leaving his. She did not look at the letter. She looked at him, as if measuring his capacity for the truth. Seeing she was cornered, Margaret made a decision. She would give him a piece of the truth, a carefully curated version that served her purpose without revealing the full, complicated depth of her own heart. "My family name was not always Ellis," she began, her voice quiet but steady, each word chosen with deliberate care. "That was my mother's name. My father's name, my grandfather's name, was Blackwood." Sebastian remained silent, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the back of his chair. "Lord Alistair Blackwood was my grandfather," she continued, "and your grandfather, Duke Alaric Langley, was his neighbor, his friend, and ultimately, his ruin. He used his wealth and influence and a series of fraudulent documents to systematically bankrupt my grandfather. He drove him to an early grave and then seized his property for a fraction of its worth, leaving my father with nothing but a disgraced name and a burning sense of injustice." Sebastian wanted to roar, to dismiss it all as a lie, the fantasy of a penniless woman seeking to enrich herself. But he could not. It aligned too perfectly with the whispers of financial trouble that had plagued his own life, the inexplicable shortfalls, the assets that were not as valuable as they appeared on paper. It was the missing piece of a puzzle he had been struggling with for years. "My goal is not your ruin, Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. "It is the restoration of my family's name. There is a ledger, my grandfather's private accounts book. It details every illegal transaction, every bribe, every forged signature. It is the proof I need to petition the crown and have my family's honor restored." Sebastian stared at her, his mind reeling. He saw the path she was on, a path that led directly to the public humiliation of the House of Langley. And yet, he also saw another path, a path to the truth. He realized with a startling clarity that her quest for the ledger, the very thing that threatened to destroy him, could also be his own key to understanding the true, precarious state of his own finances. It was a dangerous, double-edged sword. "If this ledger exists," he said slowly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "and if it proves what you say, it affects us both. The finances of this estate are entangled with the past." It was the closest he could come to a confession of his own vulnerability. "I will help you find it." Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. This was not the reaction she had expected. "But know this," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper as he leaned across the desk. "If I find you are lying, if this is some elaborate scheme to defraud me, there will be nowhere on this earth you can hide from me." A tense, unwilling partnership was formed in that moment. They were no longer just husband and wife, no longer just adversaries. They were reluctant allies, bound together by a shared, dangerous purpose, their goals temporarily and perilously aligned. Their search began in the manor's archives, a series of cold, damp rooms in the oldest part of the house. But the official records were a dead end, meticulously scrubbed of any hint of impropriety. Days of fruitless searching turned them towards the forgotten corners of the manor, the places where the detritus of generations was left to gather dust. This led them to the attic, a vast cavernous space under the eaves, filled with the ghosts of the past. Old furniture draped in white cloths stood like silent, shrouded figures. Forgotten trunks and crates were stacked high, their contents a mystery. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of old wood and dust and secrets. They worked in a tense silence at first, the shared task forcing them into a proximity that was both uncomfortable and strangely intimate. He would hold a ladder steady for her as she reached for a high shelf, his eyes tracing the line of her back. She would pass him a heavy box, their fingers brushing, sending a jolt of awareness through the dusty air. He helped her down from a stepladder, his hands closing firmly around her waist. For a moment, she was held against him, her hands on his shoulders, and the world seemed to stop. He could feel the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her dress, smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. He released her as if he'd been burned, and they both turned away, a flush rising on their cheeks. Later, while sifting through a large, leather-bound trunk, they found it. Tucked away beneath a collection of yellowed christening gowns and moth-eaten baby blankets was a series of small, velvet-covered books. They were diaries. Sebastian recognized the elegant, looping script instantly. They had belonged to his grandmother, Duchess Isolde. They sat on the dusty floor, the light from a single dormer window illuminating the pages as they began to read. At first, the entries were mundane, detailing social calls and household matters, but as they moved deeper into the years surrounding the Blackwood acquisition, the tone began to change. They discovered a woman who was deeply, profoundly unhappy, a woman trapped in a gilded cage who suspected her powerful husband of a terrible crime. Margaret's voice was a soft whisper in the silence of the attic as she read an entry aloud. "He screams in his sleep again. He speaks a name, Blackwood, and begs for a forgiveness I cannot grant, for I do not know the crime. He is a man tormented, carrying a weight on his soul that he will not share, not even with me. He calls it business, a great victory for our house, but I see no victory in his eyes. I see only the haunted look of a man who has sold a piece of himself for gold and land." The discovery was a revelation. It humanized the past, transforming the formidable, almost mythical figure of his grandfather into a flawed, tormented man, haunted by his own guilt. Sebastian looked up from the diary and saw his own turmoil reflected in Margaret's eyes. He no longer saw her as an accuser, a threat to his name. He saw her as a fellow victim of this generational sin, another soul caught in the long, dark shadow of his grandfather's crime. The emotional barrier between them, so high and so heavily fortified, began to crumble. Without thinking, he reached out and gently, so gently, brushed a smudge of dust from her cheek. His thumb grazed her skin, a tender, unexpected gesture that was more intimate than any kiss. It left them both breathless. The silence in the attic was no longer tense, but filled with a new, fragile, and unspoken connection. The fragile connection forged in the dusty attic was a delicate, untested thing. In the weeks that followed, their joint search for the ledger became the central axis of their lives, a secret purpose that bound them together even as they maintained a coolly formal distance in the presence of the staff. The manor, once a cold and lonely prison for Margaret, now felt like a puzzle they were solving together. For Sebastian, the search was a painful excavation of his own family's history. Yet with Margaret by his side, it felt less like a solitary burden and more like a shared penance. The tender moment when he had brushed the dust from her cheek lingered between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that the lines of their initial arrangement had been irrevocably blurred. But their quiet, intense focus on the past had made them careless of the present. To quell rising gossip about the reclusive new Duchess and the Duke's own withdrawal from society, their attendance at the annual London ball hosted by the Marquis of Ashworth was not a request, but a command. The ballroom was a dazzling assault on the senses, a glittering galaxy of diamonds, silks, and powdered wigs. Music from a string quartet soared to the frescoed ceilings, weaving through the cacophony of high society chatter and the clinking of champagne flutes. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 competing perfumes, hot wax from the chandeliers, and the sweet, bubbly aroma of champagne. For Sebastian, it was a familiar hell, a stage upon which he had played the part of the proud, unassailable Duke for years. Tonight, the part felt hollow, the stage flimsy. He and Margaret entered the room, and a subtle hush fell over the nearest groups. They made a striking pair, he in severe black evening wear that emphasized his height and brooding presence, she in a gown of deep sapphire silk that he had insisted she purchase. The color turned her eyes to jewels and lent her a regal air that silenced the whispers of her being a penniless nobody. They presented a united front, a subtle but powerful shift in their dynamic that did not go unnoticed. It certainly did not go unnoticed by Lord Harrington. He materialized at Sebastian's elbow as if summoned from the very ether of malice, his smile as slick and polished as the marble floors. Harrington was a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty, a rival who had long coveted the Langley prestige and who had been sniffing around the edges of Sebastian's financial troubles for months. "Langley," Harrington purred, his eyes flicking dismissively over Margaret. "I must confess, I am surprised to see you. I had heard the wolves were at your door, that the great Langley lion was finally feeling the bite." Sebastian's hand tightened instinctively on Margaret's elbow. "My affairs are my own, Harrington," he said, his voice a low warning. Harrington's smile widened, showing teeth that were a little too sharp. Of course. And this must be the new Duchess, the miracle worker." He turned his predatory charm on Margaret. "Tell me, madam, what was your family name again? I do not recall an Ellis of any particular note." The insult was deliberate, a public jab at her obscure origins, designed to humiliate both of them. Margaret felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she lifted her chin, her gaze steady. Before she could utter a single cutting syllable, Sebastian stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle, protective movement. "My wife," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a dangerously cold register that cut through the nearby chatter, "is the Duchess of Langley. That is all the note she requires. And it is a note I would advise you to remember, lest you find yourself composing apologies." The fury in his voice was so raw, so potent, it startled everyone within earshot, including Margaret. It was the roar of a lion, not cornered, but defending its territory, its mate. Harrington's eyes widened for a second, his slick facade cracking to reveal a flicker of surprise, and then intrigue. This was not the cold, calculating Duke he knew. This was a man driven by a passion he did not understand. He gave a slight, mocking bow. "My apologies, Your Grace. A most spirited defense. One might almost think the marriage was more than a simple matter of convenience." With a final, lingering look at Margaret, a look that promised future trouble, he melted back into the crowd. The carriage ride back to Langley Manor was shrouded in a thick, intimate darkness. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the road and the gentle creak of the leather upholstery were the only sounds. The encounter with Harrington had left Margaret shaken, the public reminder of her precarious position, a cold weight in her stomach. She stared out the window at the fleeting shapes of trees against the moonlit sky, feeling the familiar sting of being an outsider, a danger to the very person she was beginning to care for. She was the weakness Harrington had sensed, the crack in the Langley armor. "This is my fault," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the enclosed space. "I have brought this danger to you. My quest, my secrets, he senses them. He will not stop until he uncovers them." Sebastian, who had been sitting in stony silence, his mind replaying his own shocking outburst, turned to her. In the darkness, his face was a landscape of shadows, his eyes deep pools of unreadable emotion. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a raw, burgeoning affection that he could no longer deny. "No," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "The danger was already here, Margaret. It has been lurking in the foundations of this house for 50 years, a poison in the bloodline. You did not bring the danger. You simply brought it into the light." It was a confession, an admission that the blame was not hers alone, but a shared inheritance. He saw her not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as a partner in this tangled mess. He saw the woman who had faced him with such fire, who had worked beside him with such quiet determination, who had looked at him in the attic with an understanding that had pierced his soul. The space between them, once a vast chasm, was now so small it was non-existent. Overcome by the turbulent emotions of the evening, by the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of protecting her, of wanting her, he leaned across the carriage. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking the soft skin of her cheeks. "Margaret." He breathed her name, and it was both a question and a prayer. Then he kissed her. It was nothing like the cold, impersonal press of lips at their wedding, nor was it born of the angry, volatile spark of their first confrontation. This kiss was deliberate, a conscious surrender to a feeling that had become too powerful to contain. It was a kiss of desperation and discovery, of a love that had taken root in the most barren of soils. It was fierce and passionate, acclaiming. For a moment, Margaret was frozen in shock, and then, with a small, broken sound in the back of her throat, she surrendered. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself to him as the world tilted on its axis. The fight she had been fighting against her own attraction, the walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart, they all came crumbling down. This was not an alliance of convenience anymore. This was not a partnership of necessity. This was a man and a woman, finally, irrevocably, finding each other in the dark. The clue they needed came from Duchess Isolda's diary, from an entry written a year after the Blackwood acquisition. "My husband trusts no one," she had written, her script growing more agitated. "The secrets of his business are his alone, shared with no man save for God and, I suspect, Mr. Albright. He is the only one who does not flinch from the Duke's temper, the only one who sees the ledgers and does not question the numbers. He is more than an estate manager, he is a confessor." Mr. Albright had been dead for 30 years, his position filled by a succession of lesser men. His office, in a remote, disused wing of the manor, had been sealed for decades, a time capsule of a bygone era. It was there they went next, their new, unspoken intimacy, a silent current flowing between them. The office was cold and smelled of stale air and decaying paper. A thick layer of dust covered everything, a grey shroud over the past. A heavy oak filing cabinet, a monstrous piece of furniture, stood against one wall. Following a desperate hunch, born from the diary's mention of secrets, Sebastian began to examine it closely. He ran his hands over the wood, knocking and listening. Behind the cabinet, against the wall, he felt it, a slight give, a section of the wood paneling that was not as solid as the rest. Working together, they managed to pull the heavy cabinet away from the wall, the screech of its legs on the floorboards, a protest against the violation. There, obscured by dust and shadow, was the outline of a hidden compartment. With trembling fingers, Sebastian found the latch. The panel swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow space, and inside, lying on a small shelf, was a single, thick, leather-bound ledger. It felt impossibly heavy in Sebastian's hands, a physical weight that mirrored the gravity of its contents. They carried it to the large desk in the center of the room, the dust motes they had disturbed dancing in the single beam of light from the grimy window. With a deep breath, Sebastian opened it. The pages were filled with the meticulous, spidery script of the long-dead Mr. Albright. It was all there, every systematic, illegal transfer of funds from the Blackwood estate into shell accounts, every forged document that undervalued Blackwood's assets, every bribe paid to local officials to look the other way. It was a detailed, damning confession of a crime that had been perfectly executed and perfectly hidden. It was the proof Margaret had sought her entire life, the vindication of her family's name. She stared at the open page, at the undeniable evidence of her grandfather's ruin, and felt a wave of dizzying triumph. It was real. It was all real. Sebastian stared at the numbers, at the cold, hard facts of his family's dishonor, and felt a strange sense of relief. The phantom weight of unknown financial troubles was replaced by the solid, terrible certainty of this crime, As they stood there, united in their discovery, staring at the damning evidence that would change their lives forever, a floorboard creaked in the hallway just outside the office door. Their heads snapped up in unison, eyes wide with alarm. The sound was soft, but in the dead silence of the disused wing, it was as loud as a gunshot. They were not alone. The sound of the creaking floorboard was a gunshot in the dead silence. Sebastian and Margaret froze, their heads snapping up in unison, their eyes wide with shared alarm. The triumphant discovery of the ledger, the vindication it represented, evaporated in a single, terrifying instant. They were caught. Sebastian's hand, resting on the open ledger, instinctively slammed it shut. He moved in front of Margaret, a protective stance he wasn't even aware he was taking, his body shielding her from the unseen threat in the hallway. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic beating of their own hearts and the distant, mournful sigh of the wind outside. Every nerve was screaming. Who had followed them? Was it Harrington's man, a spy sent to uncover the very secret they had just unearthed? Or a simple servant, drawn by the noise of the filing cabinet? After an eternity that lasted only a few seconds, a reedy voice called out, "Your Grace, is everything all right?" I heard a terrible screech. It was old Hemlock, the night watchman, his voice quavering with age and concern. Relief washed over Sebastian so powerfully his knees felt weak. He exchanged a quick, silent glance with Margaret, a look that conveyed a universe of shared panic and sudden reprieve. He cleared his throat, forcing his voice into a semblance of ducal calm. "All is well, Hemlock. The Duchess and I were merely retrieving some old family documents. A cabinet leg caught on the floorboards. You may return to your rounds." "Very good, Your Grace," the voice replied, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps retreating down the corridor. They waited until the footsteps had faded completely before either of them dared to breathe again. Margaret sagged against the desk, her hand pressed to her chest. Sebastian ran a hand through his hair, the adrenaline leaving a tremor in its wake. He picked up the heavy ledger, its weight both a burden and a prize. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice low. "We take this to the study. Now." Back in the fortress of his study, the door locked, a fresh log crackling in the fireplace. The ledger sat on the polished oak desk between them. It was a physical manifestation of the chasm that had opened at their feet, a choice that had to be made. The air, once charged with the thrill of discovery and the terror of being caught, was now heavy with the agonizing weight of the truth. Margaret stared at the book, the object of her life's quest. For 20 years, this ledger had been a phantom, a myth, the key to restoring her family's name and fortune. Now it was real, solid, its pages filled with the ink of betrayal. But the triumph she should have felt was a hollow ache in her chest. She looked from the ledger to the man standing by the fire, his face etched with a weary integrity she had never seen before. The proud, arrogant Duke was gone, replaced by a man grappling with the sins of his father, or rather, his grandfather. "If I use this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "your name will be ruined. You will be a pariah. Everything you have fought to protect, this legacy, this house, it will all be gone." Sebastian turned from the fire to look at her, his grey eyes clear and startlingly direct. The brittle pride that had once been his armor was gone, stripped away to reveal the man beneath. "My name?" he asked, a bitter, humorless smile touching his lips. "My name is built on a crime, Margaret. The honor I was so desperately protecting was a phantom, a ghost story I told myself to keep the darkness at bay. What value is a title built on such a foundation? It is worthless." He walked to the desk and laid his hand flat on the ledger, not in triumph, but in surrender. He then confessed the full, dire extent of the Langley financial troubles, a secret he had guarded more closely than any other. He explained that the estate was a house of cards, the wealth an illusion maintained through careful borrowing and the selling of outlying lands. The crime committed against the Blackwoods hadn't just enriched his family, it had created a legacy of debt and decay that he had inherited. "Restitution," he said, the word tasting like ash, "would not just be a blow to our pride, it would mean losing almost everything. The vultures Harrington spoke of are very real. This ledger would be the signal for them to tear the carcass of this estate apart." The agony in his voice was her own. She saw now that her quest for justice was not a simple matter of righting an old wrong. It was a weapon that would punish the wrong man, destroying the one person who had shown her true kindness, the man she had, against all odds, come to love. Her victory would be his utter destruction. The weight of that choice was unbearable. While Sebastian and Margaret grappled with their impossible choice, Lord Harrington was making his own moves. He sat in the plush leather chair of his London solicitor's office, a smug, satisfied smile on his face. Across the desk, a weaselly private investigator named Finch laid out a series of documents. Finch had been digging into the background of the new Duchess of Langley for weeks, and he had finally struck gold. "It was the name, my lord," Finch explained, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Ellis, it was her mother's name, but her father, a penniless tutor who died of consumption, was the son of Lord Alistair Blackwood." Harrington leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with predatory delight. Blackwood, he savored the name. The family that simply vanished. After Langley so conveniently absorbed their lands, the very same, Finch confirmed. "It seems the girl Margaret and her older brother, who goes by Elle in their correspondence, have been plotting for years to find proof of the original Duke's fraud. And now she has married the grandson, placed herself right in the heart of the enemy camp." Harrington threw his head back and laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "So, the little mouse is a lioness in disguise. She married him to get close to the family secrets, to find the evidence to ruin him. This is better than I could have possibly imagined." He stood and began to pace the room, his mind racing, formulating the perfect, most public, most humiliating way to use this information. A public accusation of fraud, leveled against one of the oldest ducal titles in England. A wife who conspired to ruin her own husband from within his own home. Langley will be utterly, irrevocably destroyed. I will pick up the pieces of his estate for pennies on the pound. He stopped and turned to Finch, his smile turning cruel. "And I know just the place to light the fuse. The Ducal Charity Ball. It is the highlight of the social season, and this year it is to be hosted at Langley Manor itself." How deliciously ironic. The trap was set. The stage was prepared for a final, devastating act of social annihilation. That evening, as the sun set over Langley Manor, casting long, mournful shadows across the manicured lawns, Sebastian sought out Margaret. He found her in the library, not reading, but staring into the fire, the ledger lying closed on a table beside her. He said nothing, simply held out his hand. She looked at him, her eyes full of questions, but she took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. He led her in silence through the quiet, echoing corridors of the great house, down a narrow stone staircase she had never seen before, the air growing colder with every step. He stopped before a heavy, iron-studded door and, with a key that looked as ancient as the house itself, he unlocked it. He led her into the Langley family crypt. It was a cold, silent and solemn place, a small, vaulted chamber beneath the chapel. The air was still and smelled of stone, earth and time. Niches carved into the walls held the stone sarcophagi of generations of Langleys, their names and titles carved into the lids. Sebastian led her to the very center of the room, to the largest, most imposing tomb of all, that of his grandfather, Duke Alaric Langley. He stood before it, his hand still holding hers, a silent communion of past and present. "For my entire life," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber, "I have served these names. This legacy of stone and dust." He gestured to the tombs around them. "I have sacrificed my own happiness, my own desires, on the altar of their honor. But it is a legacy of lies, a monument to a crime." He turned from the tomb to face her, his grip on her hand tightening. The flickering light from the single lantern he carried cast his face in sharp relief, his expression one of profound, earth-shattering resolution. "My loyalty is no longer to them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is to you." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a vow more sacred than the one they had spoken in the chapel. "I do not know what will happen when this is over. We may have nothing left but our names, stripped of land and title, but we will face it together. I will not hide from this truth any longer. We will expose it ourselves, on our own terms, before Harrington or anyone else can use it as a weapon against us." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. Tears not of sorrow, but of a love so fierce and powerful it stole her breath. Her long, lonely quest for justice had led her here, to this cold, dark crypt, But it had also led her to him. It had led her to something far more valuable than land or titles, a shared future built on a foundation of truth, no matter how uncertain or difficult that future might be. She squeezed his hand, her answer clear and absolute. "Together," she whispered, the word a promise, a vow of her own, sealing their pact in the silent company of the dead. They knew Harrington would strike at the ball. They would not give him the chance. They would turn his moment of triumph into their own act of redemption. The grand ballroom of Langley Manor had never looked more magnificent, nor felt more like a gilded trap. 1,000 beeswax candles burned in tiered crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000,000 glittering shards across the polished parquet dance floor. The radiance caught on the diamonds that adorned powdered dowagers and the shimmering silks of debutantes, painting the entire scene in hues of gold and champagne. A string orchestra, tucked into an alcove, played a sprightly waltz by Mozart, but the elegant music felt thin, a fragile veneer over the simmering tension that Sebastian could feel in the very air he breathed. It was a room built for performance, and tonight the final act was set to begin. He and Margaret entered, and a path seemed to clear for them as if by an invisible force. They were a striking, united couple, moving with a calm, quiet purpose that was a stark contrast to the brittle festivity around them. He held her hand, not with the possessive grip of a proprietary duke claiming his duchess, but as a man holding onto his anchor in a raging storm. Her hand in his was steady, her presence a source of quiet strength he had never known he needed, a silent promise that he was not facing this alone. Her sapphire gown, a color he had chosen, seemed to draw all the light in the room, making her the undeniable center of gravity in his world. Across the room, he saw Lord Harrington, a predator in plum-colored silks, watching them with an unnerving stillness. Harrington's lips were moving, a venomous whisper into the ear of the influential and notoriously gossipy Earl of Covington. His eyes, small and bright, gleamed with malice. He was planting the seeds of the scandal, salting the earth, preparing the ground for the public execution he had planned. Sebastian felt a familiar cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a new, unfamiliar resolve, a fire that Margaret had kindled in him. He would not let this man, this vulture, control their story. He would not let him twist Margaret's quest for justice into a sordid tale of a conniving wife. The waltz came to a flourishing final chord. A smattering of polite applause followed. Harrington detached himself from the Earl, a smug, triumphant smile playing on his lips as he took a deliberate step towards the center of the room, ready to make his grand, ruinous speech. He raised a hand, preparing to call for attention. But before he could utter a single ruinous word, a clear, sharp chime cut through the expectant chatter. Sebastian, standing beside Margaret, had tapped his champagne glass with a silver spoon. The sound was not loud, but it was authoritative. A hush fell over the ballroom, rippling outwards from where he stood. Every eye, curious and questioning, turned to him. Harrington froze, his hand still half raised, his mouth slightly agape, a perfect portrait of thwarted ambition. His moment, so carefully orchestrated, had been stolen from him. In the sudden, profound silence of the ballroom, Sebastian stood tall, Margaret's hand held firmly in his. He felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, the collective gaze of the world he had been born to rule, a world whose foundations he was about to shatter. He looked at Margaret, saw the unwavering trust in her eyes, a faith he felt he had only just begun to earn, and he found his courage. "My friends," he began, his voice clear and strong, carrying with an unexpected resonance to every corner of the vast room. "Your graces, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen, I thank you for gracing my home with your presence tonight. I have an announcement to make." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, drawing every ounce of attention to himself. "For 50 years, my house, the House of Langley, has held its head high in society. We have been seen as a pillar of tradition, of honor. Tonight, I must confess that our honor has been built on a lie." A collective gasp, a soft, sibilant sound, rippled through the crowd. Fans stopped fluttering. Jewels seemed to dim. Harrington's face, a moment before flushed with impending victory, was now a mask of chalky fury and utter confusion. His perfectly orchestrated plan was disintegrating before his eyes. Sebastian continued, his voice unwavering, imbued with the terrible clarity of truth. "Many of you knew my grandfather, Duke Alaric. He was lauded as a shrewd man of business, a builder of fortunes. The truth is, he was a thief. More gasps, louder this time, punctuated by shocked murmurs. 50 years ago, he systematically and illegally ruined his neighbor and his friend, Lord Alistair Blackwood, using fraud, forgery, and bribery to seize his lands, his fortune, and his good name. The Blackwood estate, which has been part of the Langley holdings for 2 generations, was not purchased. It was stolen. He then turned to Margaret, his voice softening, his address to the crowd becoming an intimate declaration filled with a love and respect that was plain for all to see. And this is my wife, the Duchess of Langley. But her name was not always Ellis. She is Miss Margaret Blackwood, the granddaughter of Lord Alistair, and the rightful heir to the lands and title my grandfather stole. He raised the thick leather-bound ledger he had been holding at his side, holding it up for all to see, a dark and heavy testament to the crime. This is the proof, the estate manager's private ledger, detailing every criminal transaction, every bribe, every lie. My wife did not marry me to destroy my name, as some malicious tongues might whisper. He shot a pointed icy glare directly at Lord Harrington, who flinched as if physically struck, his face paling even further. She came to my house to reclaim her own. She sought justice, and in doing so, she has given me something far more valuable. She has given me a chance at redemption. He lowered the ledger and faced the stunned, silent assembly. I hereby renounce all fraudulent profits of the past. The Blackwood estate and all associated lands will be returned to the Blackwood family, to my wife, effective immediately. The debts of my house are my own to bear, but they will no longer be paid for by the suffering of another family. My apology to the memory of Lord Blackwood is absolute, and my restitution will be complete. He then looked directly at Harrington again, his voice ringing with cold final authority. Some, like Lord Harrington, may have wished to use this information for their own malicious gain, to see my house fall for their own profit. But the truth is not a weapon to be wielded by men of little character. It is a foundation, and my wife and I, we have chosen to build our future upon it, no matter the cost. The aftermath was a strange, surreal tableau. The orchestra remained silent, their instruments resting in their laps. The ball was over. A torrent of whispers filled the room as guests began to leave, some in a scandalized hurry, their faces alight with the thrill of gossip they would dine out on for a month. Others, however, approached Sebastian and Margaret as they stood, still united, an island of calm in the center of the room. The old formidable Duke of Wellington, a man whose opinion could make or break a reputation, walked over, his expression stern. He looked at Sebastian for a long, appraising moment, then at Margaret, and gave a short, sharp nod. "Langley," he said, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention, "you have more courage than your grandfather ever did. A damn fool thing to do financially, but the right thing. You have your honor back, boy." He turned and left, his tacit approval a shield against the worst of the coming social storm. The financial ruin was certain, a cascade of consequences already set in motion by his public declaration. But the social ruin, the utter annihilation Harrington had planned, was not. By confessing with such raw, public honesty, Sebastian had transformed a sordid scandal into a legend of integrity. He had lost a title's prestige but gained a man's honor. As the last of the guests departed, leaving them alone in the vast candle-lit ballroom, Margaret turned to him. The room was littered with abandoned glasses and the ghosts of the evening, but for the first time, it felt like their home, a place where truth had finally been spoken. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his, reflecting the flickering candlelight. He looked down at her, at the woman who had been his adversary, his partner, his salvation, and a genuine smile, the first truly happy, unburdened smile she had ever seen from him, lit up his face. "I have never been less afraid in my life," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that felt like freedom. "We have lost a fortune, Margaret, but we have gained everything that matters." He drew her into his arms, holding her close. The heavy weight of a false legacy finally lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the solid, grounding presence of the woman he loved more than any title, any land, any legacy. Months later, the sun was setting over a different landscape. Not the sprawling, manicured and heavily mortgaged parks of Langley Manor, but the gentle rolling hills of the restored Blackwood estate. The manor house was smaller, more modest, built of warm, honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the golden light of dusk. It was a house at peace with itself, its foundations solid and true. Sebastian was in the garden, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his hands covered in rich, dark earth. He was no longer a duke weighed down by a title, but a man at peace, tending to the new life he was coaxing from the soil. He looked up as Margaret came out to join him, her form fuller, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach where their child grew. They were happy, their life simpler but infinitely richer. The sale of the Langley assets had been brutal, a public dismantling of a dynasty, but it had cleared the debts, both financial and moral. They had enough. They had each other. He walked to meet her, wiping his hands on his trousers, and drew her into a gentle embrace, breathing in the scent of roses and evening air. "The roses are taking root," he said, his voice full of a quiet satisfaction she had never heard in him when he spoke of ducal matters. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn wooden box. It was the box she had brought with her to Langley Manor, the one that had held the secrets of her past. He had kept it. He handed it to her, and she opened it. The old letters, their purpose served, their ink faded like old ghosts, were gone. In their place was a new, empty journal, its pages clean and white, bound in soft, supple leather. "For our story," Sebastian said softly, his hand joining hers on her stomach, where their child, the true heir to a legacy of truth, was growing. "Let's fill it with truths." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, tears of quiet joy in her eyes. She held the book, feeling the promise of its empty pages. They stood together in the fading light, looking out at their land, their future stretching before them, a future built not on a stolen legacy, but on a love that had been strong enough to destroy a lie and build a new, more beautiful truth.